At the beginning of 1986, John Gotti officially took over the Gambino family after years of meticulous planning and eventual execution. Gotti didn't care much for secrecy, and his downfall, eventually being arrested in 1992 and sentenced to life without parole, came as a result of the destruction of the very thing that made the Mafia strong: omerta. The execution was so brazen that it not only put him in jeopardy, but also brought down the whole family and other Mafia families. He casually gathered with his members outside social clubs, such as the Ravenite Social Club and the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, as though he were invincible and immune to the FBI. However, law enforcement was able to surveil the family and expose the inner workings of the Mafia, all thanks to his hubris. The early seeds of Gotti's takeover were sown with the death of Carl Gambino. It was a period when Gotti was absolutely furious with the state of the Gambino hierarchy. On Carlo's deathbed, he made it crystal clear who he wanted as his heir, not his sons, and most surprisingly not his underboss, Aniello Neil Della Croce. This was unorthodox in the Mafia. Usually the underboss would succeed. For this very reason, it became one of the biggest power struggles in the Mafia world. This decision sent a seismic shock across the family, and its reverberations were felt deeply within Neil's faction. Neil ran 10 of the 23 crews in the Gambino family. His loyalists saw him as a competent heir to the throne. Della Croce's mob career spanned decades. He was a seasoned mobster who had once been promoted by the infamous Albert Anastasia, one of the founding fathers of the Italian-American Mafia. Everyone in Neil's wing was appalled and distraught, but could do nothing about it, as it was the boss's final wish and command. Carlo envisioned brighter days in which the Mafia could move closer to becoming a legitimate entity, already deeply involved in white-collar crime. It was one step further toward legitimacy, compared to the outdated and crude model of blue-collar crime, something Gotti and Neil were immersed in. There was one person who could make this possible in Carlos's eyes: Paul Castellano. Castellano was an experienced old-timer in the Mafia life. He was a reflection of Carlo's vision, essentially the white-collar incarnate. What made him fascinating was that he came across as a legitimate, wealthy businessman. His demeanor and style reinforced that image, yet behind the scenes he controlled major rackets in labor unions and construction. He was not the hands-on type. If he had a problem, he would send a lower-level member to do the dirty work. For example, he once instructed John Gotti to carry out a contract killing on a Gambino associate who had stepped out of line by committing the greatest sin: dealing narcotics. Nonetheless, Neil did not oppose Castellano's newfound power, as he did not think emotionally. He was dogmatic. Whatever the boss said had to be followed to the letter. One man, however, had the audacity to question his boss's decision, none other than John Gotti. Although Gotti was not among the highest ranks at the time, he was not among the lowest either. He was a capo regime, a captain, but that alone did not fully explain the confidence he had to question the family's future or openly denounce Paul Castellano as the new boss. One of the main reasons Gotti had so much confidence was that he was protected by Neil Della Croce. Whether he realized it or not, Della Croce essentially enabled his behavior. Neil had a protective streak toward Gotti. He acted as his buffer in many situations. It was not because he feared Gotti. In fact, Gotti feared him. Neil was a formidable individual in his own right. Joseph Coffey, an NYPD officer, famously described him as one of the most terrifying mobsters ever and said, his eyes were so blue that they weren't even there. But with Gotti, he had a soft spot. Perhaps because Gotti reminded him of a son. Not his biological son, though, so they did not see eye to eye. Gotti was like a younger version of Neil. They shared similar habits. Both men were avid gamblers, whether it was horses, sports, or anything else they could bet on. Like any vice, they were old enough to understand the consequences. Gotti was often in debt, but surprisingly always paid it back on time. Always. In 1971, Neil Della Croce was found guilty of contempt for not answering questions in front of a grand jury. The next year, in April 1972, he turned himself in to serve a 1-year sentence. After that, he started a separate 5-year sentence for tax crimes involving Yankee plastic stock and unpaid taxes. A pivotal example of Neil further enabling his protege was introducing him to Carlo Gambino. With Neil in prison, Gotti was able to report directly to Mr. Gambino. What happened next was a butterfly effect moment. Carlo Gambino authorized a hit for John Gotti to carry out, an event that would change his life forever. It was October 27th, 1940. John Gotti is born, the 5th of 13 children. Being in that situation was a challenge for any family, but especially one like Gotti, living in utter poverty in the Bronx, New York. From the age of 12, Gotti tried to beat the odds, but only within the cards he had been dealt. When his family moved to Brooklyn, New York specifically, East New York, he became entrenched in a life of struggle. In an economically deprived area with low opportunities and a high crime rate, the odds were stacked against him. At the age of 16, he officially entered a life of crime, forming a street gang called the Fulton Rockaway Boys. This crew of hotheads, based in East New York, acted as a recruiting ground for future Gambino members. John was joined by his older brother Pete, who was 1 year older, and his younger brother Richard, who was 2 years younger. He also formed close ties with Wilford Johnson and Angelo Ruggiero, the original Fulton Rockaway Boys. Carmine Fatico, a capo regime, mentored the group of youngsters. During this time, Gotti carried out car hijackings and other petty crimes. He eventually rose to a leadership position within the gang, credited to the leadership qualities he demonstrated from the start. Around 1960, when Gotti was around 19 and 20, he became an official associate of the East New York crew, which was essentially a subgroup of the Gambinos. In 1966, Carmine decided to move the group's operations to Ozone Park in Queens, New York. One reason was that he disliked the changing demographics, with more migrants moving into the area. But for Gotti, this relocation meant the gang could expand its criminal activity further. Another expansion came in the form of membership. John brought in his brother Gene, who was 6 years younger, while Gotti's close friend Angelo brought in his younger brother Salvatore. Their early roots in Brooklyn were not forgotten. They named their base the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club after Bergen Street, the place where it all started. They are now known as the Ozone Park Crew. The geography of the social club was its biggest asset. It was located near JFK Airport, allowing the crew to rake in money through truck hijackings and stolen cargo. It was around this time that Gotti connected with Neil Delacroce. This connection came through Fatico's status as a capo regime, as captains reported directly to the underboss. Moreover, Neil was Angelo's maternal uncle. Gotti viewed Neil as the embodiment of Cosa Nostra. He was a man's man, a mentor, and a father figure. Gotti despised his biological father, as he did not see him as a proper provider for the family. Neil became a representation of what manhood meant to Gotti. Gotti's need for a father figure met Neil's apparent need for a son figure, and it's understandable why they grew so close. In September 1963, Joseph Allacci became the first mafioso to inform on the mob. Allacci believed he was going to die. He was facing a potential death penalty from the federal government for killing a fellow inmate in prison, as well as a possible death sentence from Vito Genovese, who believed he was an informant. Allacci was willing to break omerta in return for life imprisonment and protection. In Allacci's Senate testimony, he laid out the inner workings of the Mafia, from the 5 New York families to the induction rituals and the internal structure of each family. He exposed the role of each position. It essentially operated like a business and can be explained through its cash flow. At the ground level were associates, who worked with the crew and brought in money who were not inducted members. Above them were soldiers, the lowest rank of made members. Both associates and soldiers typically kicked up a share of their earnings to their capo, who supervised the crew and took a cut. The capo then passed a portion upward to the family leadership, led by the boss with the underboss acting as the boss's deputy. The consigliere sat with the top leadership as a counselor and mediator, advising on disputes and strategy rather than running a crew's day-to-day operations. The boss, underboss, and consigliere together made up the administration. The 5 New York families made up the commission, a place to operate business and settle disputes. This galvanized the government to introduce the RICO Act in 1970, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. This was a game changer. It allowed prosecutors to target the entire family. Previously, it was usually low-level members, such as associates who were prosecuted. But now, even the administration could be held just as guilty. Carlo Gambino was very aware of the direction the law was heading, so he created a new framework to counteract it. When Neil was in prison, he created a direct channel for the capo regimes to report directly to the boss. Since there was no underboss at the time, once again Neil made Gotti's life easier by speaking well of him to Carlo before this moment. It was in his apartment in Sheepshed Bay that Carlo introduced Gotti to Niccolò Machiavelli's work. Carlo Gambino was strongly drawn to Machiavelli, seeing in the 16th century thinker a cold view of power that matched the struggles he faced within the American Mafia, an approach John Gotti would later display as well. Gambino also shared a short excerpt from Machiavelli's political work, The Prince.
The lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. One must therefore be a fox to recognize traps, and a lion to frighten wolves.
Carlo wanted to avoid legal traps and schemes that dragged in federal agencies. That's why he drew hard lines around things like counterfeit work, stock and bond scams, and narcotics, and he expected Gotti to carry that warning back to the Bergen crew. The problem was that the warning landed in a crew that was already tangled up in drugs. So when Gotti delivered the no narcotics message at the Bergen, it didn't change what people knew about the crew. It highlighted it. In that room, the speech functioned more like an official statement he was required to repeat, rather than a rule everyone believed would actually be followed. Early 1973. The 1970s were marked by tension between the Irish and Italian mobs. The Irish mob had become known for kidnapping Italian mobsters for ransom. Carlo Gambino's nephew, Emanuele Manny Gambino, became a victim. The kidnappers demanded $350,000. The $40,000 they received did not suffice, so they ended his life. This infuriated Carlo. The next favor he asked of Gotti would be his biggest and last. He gave him a contract killing James Jimmy from Queens McBratney, the man he believed responsible for the kidnapping and murder. The single order would change the trajectory of John Gotti's life. On the 22nd of May, 1973, at 11 p.m., Snoopy's Bar and Grill on Staten Island was chosen as a location. The plan was to abduct McBratney away from the public and then carry out the hit. The trio, John Gotti, Angelo Ruggiero, and Ralph Gallioni, approached McBratney pretending to be police officers, performing the routine and steering him toward the exit before anyone could react. But McBratney resisted. He challenged them and began to tussle with Gotti and Angelo. In a bar packed with people, Ralph Gallioni panicked and pulled the trigger, firing 4 shots into McBratney's head and chest in full view of witnesses. Months later, the killers were still at large. After the McBratney hit, law enforcement pressure intensified. The New York police presented a photo array, and 2 witnesses identified John Gotti and Angelo Ruggiero. As for the third perpetrator, there was not enough information, at least initially, but the FBI had someone who could prove it. Willie Boy had been an informant all along, an original Fulton Rockaway boy who witnessed the formation of the Ozone Park crew. It was shocking to learn that he had been cooperating since 1966. Informants were not foxes or lions, they were rats. They abandoned the family when danger appeared, saving themselves like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Being a rat was considered the gravest sin because it meant breaking omerta. Source Wahoo, as the FBI called him, did not turn against the family without reason. His motives were personal. He felt abandoned by his captain, Carmine Fatico, who had once promised to financially support his wife and children while he was in prison, but failed to keep that promise. Although he was close to Gotti and Angelo, he never felt fully accepted. To some, he was always an outsider, partly because he was Native American, not Italian, meaning he could never be formally inducted as a member. Over time, that resentment grew. Eventually, Johnson provided investigators with information about the third perpetrator and revealed that Gotti had bragged about the killing. Law enforcement intensified its efforts to locate those responsible. In July 1973, Angelo and Ralph were arrested and awaited trial, but Gotti remained on the run. Within the Mafia, if someone was suspected of potentially becoming a rat, especially when facing a life sentence, others would often attempt to eliminate them before they could cooperate. This was the fate of Gaglione. In December 1973, he was shot dead in Brooklyn, in the hallway of his apartment building. No one officially claimed responsibility, but many within the life believed it was connected to the chaos at Snoopy's, and that he had become a liability. In June 1974, Gotti was finally located and arrested through information provided by Willie Boy. Through the boss's connections, they secured a high-profile defense attorney, Roy Cohn, one of the most astute and well-connected lawyers in the country. Cohn managed to negotiate the charges down to attempted manslaughter instead of murder, resulting in a 4-year sentence. To help keep this channel growing and continue producing high-quality videos, please consider supporting me on Patreon using the link in the description. I'll be featuring supporter names in my videos and a color-coded format based on the tier you chose. Gold tier supporters will appear in gold, silver tier supporters in silver, and bronze tier supporters in bronze. If you decide to join, thank you. Your support helps keep this channel alive. Gotti's time in prison was relatively comfortable. He lifted weights, built connections, and even maintained contact with the outside world through bribed officers. During this period, an indirect connection formed between John Gotti and Sammy the Bull of Gravano. While in prison, Gotti intervened to protect one of Sammy's friends from being harmed by a gang of inmates, something Sammy appreciated from the outside. After Gotti was released, he and Sammy the Bull Gravano finally met face-to-face at Frankie DeChico's club. Sammy was there with Frankie and his father, Boozy, while Gotti arrived with his usual entourage. It was a simple, almost casual introduction. Sammy acknowledged what John had done. Unbeknownst to both men, it marked the quiet beginning of a relationship that would shape the future of the Gambino family. Although Sammy grew up around Cosa Nostra in Brooklyn and Gotti in Queens, their rise through the life was remarkably similar. Gotti was first guided by Carmine Fatico, while Sammy learned under Thomas Shorty Spiro. Later, Gotti found his mentor in Neil Delacroce, and Sammy found his mentor in Toto Orello. While Gotti was still in prison, devastating news broke on October 15, 1976. Carlo Gambino, the longtime boss and one of the most powerful figures in American organized crime, died of a heart attack. He chose Paul Castellano as his successor. At first glance, this seemed like a break from Mafia tradition. Typically, power is passed to the underboss. However, within the Gambino family, the choice was not entirely unexpected. Carlo's health had been deteriorating for years, and in 1964 he elevated Paul from capo to acting boss, demonstrating that he saw him as leadership material. Furthermore, when Carlo suffered a heart attack in 1971, Paul was already serving as acting boss, while Neil was going to serve time in prison for years. Many members were accustomed to Castellano leading. There was also speculation that Joe Gallo, the family's consigliere, might have been next in line. However, after suffering a serious heart attack in 1974, his declining health made that impossible, and the matter was left to others. Around late 1976, Neil was out of prison, 24th of November 1976, when Paul Castellano officially became boss of the Gambino crime family. He held a meeting. Neil attended it. Paul allowed Neil to retain control of his 10 crews. This was a testament to the unspoken rift within the family. Certain members sided with Neil, while others aligned themselves with Big Paul. On July 28, 1977, John Gotti was paroled from prison, just 2 years into his sentence. He returned with a greater status. Through Neil's support, he moved from soldier to capo regime, once again demonstrating Neil's consistent vouching for him. At this time, Gotti displayed immense loyalty to Neil, remaining openly frustrated that Castellano had been chosen. Gotti believed Castellano was jealous of Neil's influence and of the fact that Neil was a real gangster. Paul Castellano himself had reservations about Gotti. He viewed Gotti's heavy gambling as reckless. It was not only Gotti who disliked the decision. Many believed Carlo chose Paul out of nepotism. Paul was both his cousin and his brother-in-law. The justification here was that Carlo was doing this to strengthen La Cosa Nostra. Those who disliked Castellano nicknamed him the Pope because he stayed secluded in his 17-room mansion, rarely appearing in social clubs or on the streets. In 1957, the Mafia closed the books, meaning no new members could become made men. This was done because leaders believed tighter control was necessary during a period of heavy law enforcement pressure, when mob infiltration was a serious concern. Around 1975 to 1976, this rule was relaxed, and the books were reopened to a limited number of members. Toto Arello, Sammy's capo, ran one crew in Castellano's wing. Because of this, Sammy was exposed more to the white-collar side of life. Construction rackets, union deals, and large-scale financial scams. This was the world Sammy operated in, but it did not mean his loyalty was fully aligned with Paul. Sammy the Bull Gravano was inducted in 1976, and Gotti followed in 1977. From that point on, John Gotti and Sammy Gravano operated as official soldiers within the Gambino crime family, but from opposite ends of a divided house. The cardinal rules for becoming a made man were simple and absolute. The major ones were, never harm another made man, including one from another family, and never deal drugs. Breaking either rule meant death. Yet the ink was barely dry on Gotti's oath before the hypocrisy appeared. His crew, including his brother Peter, Angelo's brother Salvatore, and another addition, Anthony Roach Rampino, which he recruited during his years in prison, was all deeply involved in heroin trafficking. The year 1980 began extremely rough for Gotti. His 12-year-old son Frank Gotti died in a tragic accident while riding his mini-bike near the family home in Howard Beach, Queens. Many members noticed a shift in John during this period. He appeared more reserved. Later that same year, an event occurred that showed that, despite Gotti's resentment toward Castellano, he still followed orders. It also demonstrated that Castellano was not a soft boss. In fact, quite the opposite. Paul Castellano ordered the hit of his daughter's boyfriend after the young man made a joke comparing Paul's appearance to that of his poultry competitor Frank Perdue, saying he not only looked like Paul but resembled a chicken. This enraged Paul to the point that he assembled a hit team composed of Gambino and Bonanno members to eliminate him. This murder revealed how dangerous Paul could be, a man quietly pulling the strings, even if it began as just a joke. The reaction suggested something deeper. Paul likely interpreted it as public disrespect, which struck at his authority. Protective of the empire he had built, he could not allow anyone to undermine him or make him appear weak. He turned it into an example. However, this warning did not faze Gotti. A meeting that year between Paul and Neil only solidified Gotti's belief that Paul was a weak and incompetent boss. During one meeting, Neil reportedly told Paul to shut up, after Paul complained that people consulted Neil rather than him. Meanwhile, Wilford Johnson's resentment grew, particularly toward Angelo, and he began feeding the FBI information. Through Willie Boy and other informants, the FBI's Gambino squad obtained a judge's approval to install a bug in Angelo's Howard Beach home, after he casually told Source Wahoo that his house was safe. The FBI expected to hear routine discussions about loan sharking and illegal gambling. However, Angelo, nicknamed Quack Quack for being outspoken, revealed more than expected. Agents were stunned when they heard Ruggiero casually speak to Gene Gotti about babania, a coded reference to heroin. That single word opened a Pandora's box for the family, leading to serious consequences. Quack Quack's references to narcotics allowed the FBI to justify long-term surveillance. Even when he relocated to a new home in Cedarhurst, Long Island, authorities were permitted to continue the wiretaps. Numerous small recordings were added to the growing body of evidence, but it was not until May 1982 that major developments occurred. In May, Angelo's younger brother, and one of the original Ozone Park members, Salvatore Ruggiero, died when his private plane crashed into the Atlantic Ocean. As a fugitive, he had relied on private planes to move between states. After Salvatore's death, Angelo handled his brother's possessions. He visited his New Jersey hideout, retrieved heroin stored there, and later sold it. These events were captured and confirmed through the wiretaps at Angelo's home, where his lawyer, Michael Coiro, was recorded discussing how Gene Gotti had discovered the heroin. Paul hated narcotics like Carlo. To him, being boss meant being a CEO. The family's operations were a business and narcotics were bad business. Long life sentences mean a member is likely to flip to reduce their sentence. Banning drugs was simple risk management. The problem was that many families, especially the newer wave of Gambinos, didn't seem to get the message. He applied that risk management logic in January 1983, when he ordered the killing of his own soldier, Roy DeMeo. DeMeo was believed to have been involved in around 200 murders, and his crew was heavily involved in narcotics. His DeMeo crew operated out of the Gemini Lounge in Brooklyn, a location investigators later described as a virtual killing factory, where victims were murdered in a methodical way. Castellano saw danger. DeMeo could start cooperating to benefit himself. Another topic Angelo spoke loosely about was his boss, Big Paulie. He implicated Paul in several crimes, which led investigators to plant a bug in Paul's Staten Island mansion. There, Castellano further implicated himself in separate RICO cases. For example, evidence regarding the Concrete Club contributed to Rudolph Giuliani's racketeering case against the New York families. In August 1983, Angelo implicated himself. The Angelo tapes led to the arrest of Angelo and 12 others. The heroin crew was exposed, and their actions were about to be revealed to Paul. Years later, Sammy Gravano stated that Gotti saw an opportunity in the Angelo tapes and did not genuinely care about Angelo. Gotti used the controversy to rally support against Paul, cultivating a sense of an impending threat from Castellano's faction among family members. During the arrests, Paul became aware of the situation, but had not yet heard the tapes. He knew that Gotti's crew was involved in something, but gave them the benefit of the doubt, choosing to wait for the tapes to provide clarification, as it could have been a misunderstanding. Angelo's initial excuse was that the crew had been involved in narcotics, only to dispose of what was left in Salvatore's hideout. Neil was the only person who could make Paul reconsider, yet he was strongly opposed to drugs and would naturally disapprove of Angelo's actions and his loose talk. However, wiretaps later suggested that once again, Neil intervened to protect John Gotti. Although Neil did not believe the excuse, he relayed it to Paul and urged him to wait until the tapes were officially unsealed. On March 30th, 1984, Castellano was indicted alongside more than 20 co-defendants on racketeering charges centered on an international stolen car ring connected to the Gambino crime family, specifically the DeMeo crew. His fears of a member turning informant were realized when Dominic Montilio, an associate and chauffeur for his uncle and capo, Anthony Nino Gaggi, began cooperating with authorities. Montilio's value lay in being a peripheral insider, close enough to know the inner workings of the Gambino family. During the summer of 1984, Aniello Della Croce was diagnosed with cancer while also dealing with heart disease. Around this time, Castellano announced a strict rule: any member made after 1962 who dealt in narcotics would be killed. This was an indirect but unmistakable warning to the Gotti crew that he was watching them. Once again, Neil did everything he could to insulate them. He maintained that no conclusion should be drawn until the official legal transcripts were released and on tape, and speculation would be unnecessary as the tapes included personal information about Angelo that didn't need to be heard. Paul accepted this reasoning. Whether it was naivety or a sense of helplessness, he chose to wait. Still, he dropped subtle hints that he was not entirely unaware of what was happening. In early 1985, Gotti was dealing with his own legal battles. A rising star assistant attorney, Diane Giacalone, was building a RICO case against John Gotti. It was here when Gotti got the distressing news that his childhood friend, Wilfred, was a rat all along. She felt it would make her case more compelling. but the FBI felt it had gone against everything. Gotti reassured Willie Boy he was safe until the case was won. In late 1985, Dominic Montilio further implicated Paul Castellano in receiving criminal earnings from his uncle. Additionally, when Gotti was not present, Roy DeMeo would personally report to Paul. Altogether, this reinforced the prosecution's argument that the Gambino family operated with a clear hierarchy, with Paul at the apex. It was 2 weeks after Della Croce's death. The location is Manhattan by the East River. 7 months of preparation led to this point. A final briefing. Killing the boss of a crime family was unprecedented and nerve-wracking. Gotti's job was to remind everyone why they were here, why Paul had to go. He kept it blunt. Midtown Manhattan, Spark Steakhouse. Location for a quick attack on the busy streets. Couple shots to the domes of their target, and they disperse away from the traffic and noise before anyone understood what they've seen. Sounds simple. The real story is how a small group got comfortable doing the unthinkable, and how they built a plan designed not only to kill, but to take power and keep it. The main conspirators became known as the Fist. 5 members: John Gotti, Sammy Gravano, Frankie DeCicco, Joseph Armoni, and Robert D. Bernardo. This wasn't random. Each man filled a gap the takeover needed. Although Gotti played a huge role in planning the hit, on the day of the hit, he was merely the driver. Sammy Gravano would sit in the passenger seat, using his walkie-talkie to give orders. To get to this point, Sammy Gravano coordinated much of the logistical planning. He decided where each participant would stand and how they'll act. Gotti convinced Sammy months earlier by sending a message through Angelo Ruggiero. He told Sammy Gravano that Castellano planned to have Sammy killed. Gravano was already frustrated with Castellano, from allowing the Genovese to kill a Gambino capo regime to ignoring the concerns of the street crews. The idea that Paul might be targeting him didn't feel impossible. Sammy was surprised that Gotti didn't come in person to tell him, but he trusted both Gotti and Angelo enough to take the warning seriously. He wanted to speak with Frank DeCicco, who became a key voice in what happened next. Sammy expressed doubts about Gotti becoming boss, saying he thought Frank would be a better fit. Frank disagreed. He said Gotti was smart and capable, and that together they could make it work. Frank added that he could serve as Gotti's underboss, but Gotti could never be his. Gotti's ego wouldn't allow it. Frank also made a promise. If things went wrong, he and Sammy would take out Gotti themselves. After a long discussion, both men agreed to join the emerging plot. Frank DeCicco was the next Fist member. He was integral to the plan, serving as the peacemaker between the two factions. His job was to placate the other side and remain separate from the action. He was to handle the political aftermath by calming the capo's reaction inside the restaurant. Di Bernardo was a major earner with serious union influence. He wasn't part of the sidewalk ambush. His value was what he represented afterwards: money, reach, and continuity once the power structure flipped. The plan was solid but lacked a key component: someone to manage the consequences of the assassination and prevent internal turmoil. This is where Joseph Joe Piney Armone came in, a veteran capo, respected by the old guard. His support gave the takeover legitimacy and reassured the reluctant members. Armone understood the situation. In his younger years, Piney himself was involved in a heroin trafficking ring, the famous Pizza Connection case, and was arrested in 1964. For an old-timer, that history was surprising, but it's exactly why Gotti's crew felt comfortable bringing him in. Back in the summer of 1985, the tapes became public. Indictments were closing in, and Castellano looked boxed in. To the street side, that's when a boss starts looking for problems to remove so he can protect himself. Gotti's theory was that Paul would eventually target his faction for causing such problems, and that he'd wait until Neil was gone so there'd be no buffer. Then Castellano floated something that stuck in Gotti's mind as proof: a panel of 3 acting street bosses: Thomas Bilotti, Thomas Gambino, and John Gotti. It was peculiar, usually since there's one acting boss, not 3. Gotti took it as a put-down, a message he wasn't willing to accept. It was as if Paul were buying time rather than addressing the real problem with Gotti. The green light came on December 2nd, 1985, and Delacroce died. With Neil gone, restraint disappeared. Castellano made matters worse. He didn't attend Neil's funeral, citing legal concerns. On the street side, that wasn't caution, it was disrespect. For Gotti and his friends, this was the nail in the coffin. The setup had layers. The shooters were loyalists outside the fist. 4 shooters in matching tan trench coats and fur hats would converge from both sides of East 46th Street as soon as the duo exited the car. The clothing were chosen to blur memory and jumble descriptions. The location, Midtown Manhattan, was chosen to blur witness memory through its chaotic streets. Anthony Rampino was positioned across from Sparks as backup. Further east, additional support and vehicles were staged for the exit. Gotti and Sammy positioned themselves as they could watch without being noticed, then blend in with regular traffic. Another thing Gotti said emphatically, Bellotti had to be hit too. He had been just made underboss after Neil's death and was loyal enough to retaliate immediately. Leaving him alive meant leaving behind the most predictable counterattack. Another person expected to retaliate was Chin Gigante. Mafia rules require commission approval to kill a boss. Gotti knew approval would not come from Chin, and he was likely to treat it as a war. So he decided to do it without permission, timing it just before Christmas. Once the layers were set, it was go time. DeCicco passed the timing and location directly to Gotti and Gravano. Castellano was invited to a dinner meeting, 5 p.m. at Sparks Steakhouse, East 46th Street, Midtown Manhattan, with several Gambino capos, Frank DeCicco, Tommy Gambino, James Jimmy Brown Fela, Danny Marino, and his newly appointed underboss, Thomas Bellotti. Castellano believed he was meeting loyal, reliable men, as John and Sammy waited in their position.
Meet look! It's Tommy and Paul. They're close.
Sammy quietly radioed confirmation that the targets were approaching. At around 5:30 p.m., Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti were pronounced dead. After the attack, DeCicco tried to calm down James
These guys had
Fela.
one objective, to take down Paul and his right-hand man. They're not after you.
The plan to do it in a busy Midtown paid off. News coverage exploded. Cameras crowded outside Sparks and headlines spread across New York before the bodies had even been removed. That same night, the group behind the plot gathered at Sammy Gravano's construction office in Brooklyn. Gotti told them the family would be stronger moving forward. 2 days later, the Gambino capos met at Gravano's restaurant. Outside the meeting room, Gravano and Angelo Ruggiero waited armed as an intimidation tactic. Consigliere Joseph Ingallo led the meeting, following instructions established in advance. Earlier, Joseph Armone had informed Gallo that any resistance would lead to a major war, which was the last thing the family wanted. In the last days of 1985, Gotti called a second meeting to select a new boss. Frank DeCicco voted for John Gotti, and no one objected. The vote was unanimous. Gotti became the Don of the Gambino family, and now controlled thousands of members, 300 being made men. DeCicco became underboss. Angelo Ruggiero was made a captain, and Sammy Gravano was promoted to capo. Toto Arello resigned as a captain, but supported Sammy from afar. Almost immediately, Gotti became a public figure. His $1,800 tailored suits, confident posture, and flamboyance earned him the nickname the Dapper Don. Gotti's authority solidified quickly, and the assassination at Sparks became one of the most analyzed episodes in organized crime. Gravano's behind-the-scenes work and management of the transition were central to the takeover success and the family's later stability. The partnership that lifted Gotti to the top would not last. And the years ahead, the same man who helped Gotti rise would play a decisive role in ending it.